There is a quiet assumption baked into modern culture. If someone isn't constantly visible, if they never post their face, their lifestyle, their wins, their appearance, then something must be wrong with them. Something must be missing. But that assumption says far more about the culture making it than about the person being judged. Because for many empaths, the choice to stay off camera isn't a symptom of low self-worth. Often, it's the exact opposite. It can be the sign of a mind that has already outgrown the need for constant outside approval. And this is where the psychology gets genuinely fascinating. Most people have been quietly trained to confuse attention with worth. Somewhere along the way, being seen became tangled up with being valuable. The more eyes on you, the more significant you must be. The more approval you collect, the more secure you must feel. Social media didn't create this belief, but it weaponized it, turning validation into something you can literally count. Likes became proof. Comments became emotional currency. Views became a warped measure of status. But empaths experience this whole system differently, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why some of the most emotionally powerful people you're booming have almost no trace of themselves online. Empaths tend to be unusually tuned into the emotional current running underneath ordinary behavior. They don't just see the surface exchange, someone posting a picture, others reacting to it. They sense the hidden transaction happening beneath it, the quiet plea for affirmation, the performance dressed up as sharing, the unspoken bargain that says, "Notice me, approve of me, tell me I matter." For a self-aware empath, tuning into that constantly becomes draining, not because posting is wrong, but because they resist the idea of tying their identity to public reaction, and that's the real distinction most people miss. Not wanting to be validated is different from not wanting to be seen at all. There's a real gap between wanting connection and needing confirmation. Many empaths have spent years being emotionally attuned to other people, and somewhere in that process, they start protecting something rare, an identity that outside opinion can't touch. Think about how unusual that actually is in a culture built entirely on performance. Most people are taught to construct an image. Empaths often feel pulled, instead, toward protecting a reality, because they understand something the rest of the culture keeps missing. The more your identity fuses with public approval, the easier it becomes to lose yourself completely. Once your sense of worth starts depending on other people's response, you become emotionally outsourced. Your confidence rises and falls based on who happens to notice you that day. Your peace becomes negotiable. Your self-image becomes partly owned by strangers who scroll past you in seconds. Mature empaths sense the danger hidden inside that arrangement. They'd rather be rooted than admired. They'd rather be authentic than impressive. Sometimes they would honestly rather be unknown than misunderstood. This tends to come from a deeper internal orientation. Empaths often value essence over appearance, substance over display, meaning over spectacle. And when someone genuinely values inner coherence more than outer recognition, public self-promotion starts to feel oddly pointless. Because if you already know exactly who you are, what exactly are you trying to prove? That single question makes people uncomfortable, because so much of modern behavior is quietly built on proving something. Proving attractiveness, proving success, proving happiness, proving relevance. But empaths often step back from systems that demand constant proof, not out of arrogance, but out of liberation. They stop performing an identity and start simply living inside it, and that one shift changes everything about how they move through the world. You'll notice that many emotionally mature people become more private as they grow, not less. That isn't withdrawal, that's refinement. They come to realize not every truth needs an audience. Not every moment needs a witness. Not every part of the self belongs on a public feed. And maybe most importantly, not everything gets more valuable the moment it's exposed. Some things actually deepen in privacy. Peace deepens in privacy. Self-trust deepens in privacy. Clarity deepens in privacy. Empaths tend to understand this on an almost instinctive level, without ever needing it explained to them. There's another layer here that most people never stop to consider. Many empaths are unusually sensitive to comparison culture, not because they feel threatened by others, but because they recognize exactly how destructive comparison is to the human mind. They watch what happens when identity turns into competition, when people start curating a life instead of actually living one, when self-worth gets trapped in an endless loop of measuring, performing, and chasing the next emotional reward. And many empaths simply opt out of that loop entirely. That isn't passivity. That is psychological independence. It's a refusal to let an algorithm define self-perception. It's a refusal to let identity get repackaged into a product. And in a culture obsessed with being constantly witnessed, there is real power in choosing to be self-defined instead. That kind of power gets misread constantly. Silence gets mistaken for insecurity. Privacy gets mistaken for weakness. Restraint gets mistaken for absence. But some of the most emotionally secure people alive have zero interest in constant visibility, simply because they are no longer hungry for what attention actually feeds. They've found nourishment somewhere else, in purpose, in inner stillness, in real relationships, in self-respect. And none of that shows up on an algorithm's dashboard. One of the clearest signs of real inner stability is the ability to exist without constantly announcing yourself, to know your own worth without displaying it, to carry depth without packaging it for an audience, to remain whole without needing applause to confirm it. That isn't social detachment. That is freedom. And for many empaths, choosing not to post their photos becomes a quiet expression of exactly that freedom, a silent statement that identity was never meant to be a performance, that worth doesn't require witnesses, that presence isn't diminished just because it's private. And maybe that's exactly what unsettles other people the most, because once someone stops needing validation, they become almost impossible to control. They can't be manipulated through approval. They can't be pulled into comparison easily. They can't be seduced by shallow recognition. That kind of psychological independence is rare, but it's real. And plenty of empaths are quietly living it every single day, not because they're hiding, but because they've simply stopped confusing visibility with value. And that might be one of the most quietly radical things a person can do in this era, because the moment you stop asking the world to confirm your worth is the exact moment you finally start owning it completely. Once you understand that many empaths avoid visibility for reasons that have nothing to do with insecurity, a more interesting question opens up. Why do so many of them go out of their way to protect their privacy so fiercely? And this is exactly where most people get the psychology wrong, because privacy for an empath usually isn't about hiding. It's about protection. Highly sensitive people experience exposure very differently than everyone else. What feels harmless to one person can feel invasive to an empath. What looks like casual sharing to most people can feel, to a deeply perceptive mind, like leaving a door open that might not be easy to close again. Empaths don't just think in terms of information, they think in terms of energy. Whether you interpret that emotionally, psychologically, or philosophically, the underlying pattern is identical. They understand instinctively that the moment you reveal something about yourself, you invite interpretation, and interpretation is never neutral. The second an image goes public, it stops belonging only to you. It enters other people's projections, judgments, envy, admiration, resentment, assumptions, and private unconscious narratives. Most people barely register this happening. Empaths often feel it immediately, and that sensitivity fundamentally reshapes how they approach self-disclosure. Because they've learned something subtle but important. Not everyone watching you is watching with clean intentions. Some observe through comparison. Some observe through quiet envy. Some observe searching for weakness. And some, maybe most dangerously, observe looking for access. Empaths who have been manipulated, betrayed, or emotionally exploited in the past tend to become acutely aware of this pattern, and that awareness reshapes behavior permanently. A person who has learned firsthand that visibility can invite intrusion stops treating privacy casually. They start treating it as a boundary, and psychologically speaking, boundaries are one of the clearest markers of emotional health a person can develop. This matters because people constantly misread guardedness. They call it withdrawal, They call it fear. They call it avoidance. But what they're actually witnessing, most of the time, is discernment. And discernment is not the same thing as distrust. It's the ability to tell the difference between what deserves access and what doesn't. That is wisdom. And empaths tend to earn that wisdom the hard way, through painful experience. Because plenty of empaths spend years overexposing themselves emotionally before they learn this lesson. They give too much, reveal too much, trust too fast, assume everyone shares the same sincerity they do, and then reality corrects them. They run into gossip, projection, manipulation, people who study their vulnerabilities like a map, people who use openness as leverage against them. After enough of these experiences repeat themselves, something inside the empath finally shifts. They stop treating openness as automatically virtuous and start treating selectivity as necessary instead. This shift is a genuine psychological evolution because immature sensitivity tends to leak everywhere. Mature sensitivity protects itself, and that protection often shows up as privacy. Sometimes it looks like refusing to post personal photos. Sometimes it looks like keeping meaningful moments off public platforms entirely. Sometimes it looks like refusing to hand strangers effortless access to the intimate details of an entire life, not out of fear of being seen, but because the person has finally become intentional about who earns the right to see them. There's enormous strength hidden inside that decision, especially in a culture that treats constant exposure as the default setting for normal life. We live in an era where oversharing gets rebranded as authenticity. But authenticity without boundaries isn't authenticity at all. It's vulnerability, with no discernment attached to it. Empaths, once they mature, start to understand that difference clearly. They realize not every observer has earned entry into their inner or outer world. And once that realization sets in, everything changes. Privacy stops feeling like an absence and starts feeling like sovereignty. There's one more layer here that almost nobody talks about. Empaths tend to be highly attuned to emotional residue, the psychological aftertaste that lingers once an interaction ends, the exhaustion that follows unnecessary exposure, that strange heaviness that comes from feeling watched, interpreted, or emotionally entangled in too many other people's perceptions at once. Others might dismiss that feeling entirely. Empaths tend to live inside it. And whether you explain it through neuroscience, emotional sensitivity, or basic interpersonal dynamics, the underlying evidence points the same direction. Highly sensitive individuals process social stimuli more deeply. They experience judgment more intensely. They ruminate longer over criticism that other people barely register at all. So what looks, from the outside, like overprotectiveness might actually be a completely rational response to heightened internal processing. In other words, they aren't avoiding some imagined danger, they're preventing a very real and anticipated one. That's not weakness. That is psychological intelligence. And the strongest people usually understand prevention far better than reaction. They don't wait around to repair repeated harm. They build their lives to reduce unnecessary harm before it ever happens. And that's exactly what boundaries do. That's exactly what privacy does. This is also why many empaths refuse to confuse accessibility with kindness. They don't believe being endlessly open to everyone is some kind of virtue. They understand that unrestricted access invites chaos, and chaos has a special talent for draining sensitive people faster than anyone else. So they become selective, quietly, deliberately, sometimes almost invisibly. Other people misread that as distance. Most of the time, it's actually discipline, because privacy isn't always about keeping other people out. Sometimes, it's simply about keeping yourself intact. That might be the deeper truth hiding underneath all of this. Protecting your peace isn't selfish. Limiting unnecessary exposure isn't paranoia. Deciding that some parts of your life stay sacred isn't antisocial. It's self-governance, and psychologically, self-governance is one of the highest forms of emotional maturity a person can reach. The person who decides what to reveal, what to withhold, who earns access, and where their emotional boundaries begin, that person isn't hiding. That person is conscious, and consciousness always looks strange to people still operating unconsciously. That's exactly why empaths get misunderstood so often. Their restraint gets mistaken for insecurity. Their privacy gets mistaken for secrecy. Their boundaries get mistaken for walls. But walls isolate, while boundaries preserve. And learning the difference between those two, things can completely transform a life. Because eventually, every empath faces the same quiet decision. Will they keep making themselves endlessly available just to prove they're open? Or will they protect what actually matters, because they finally understand its worth? That isn't a small choice. It's the exact line between emotional depletion and emotional sovereignty. And maybe the deepest lesson buried in all of this is simple. What you protect reveals what you truly believe is precious. If an empath protects their peace, their image, their inner world, their private life, it's probably not because they fear the world. It's probably because they've finally understood their own value. And the moment you stop treating privacy as hiding, you start seeing it for what it actually is, the intelligent defense of something sacred. Once you understand that many empaths aren't avoiding visibility, and aren't simply protecting their privacy either, a deeper pattern starts to surface. For a lot of them, the decision to stop constantly posting their lives connects to something even more fundamental. They're often far more interested in experiencing life than performing it. And that distinction might be one of the biggest psychological divides of this entire era. Modern culture has quietly trained an entire generation to confuse documentation with participation, to believe that if a moment isn't shared, it somehow matters less, that if an experience isn't displayed, it's incomplete, that if nobody else witnesses it, it loses meaning. But empaths tend to resist that logic instinctively, because they usually relate to life through presence rather than performance. And those are two radically different ways of existing. Performance asks, how will this look? Presence asks, how fully am I actually living this? Performance turns a moment outward. Presence turns awareness inward. And empaths often feel the tension between those two states very intensely, because the moment you start curating an experience for an audience, something quietly shifts. Attention splits in half. Part of you stays immersed in the moment. Part of you steps outside it to manage perception, frame the shot, package the story, anticipate the reaction. Many empaths feel that fracture happening in real time, and they resist it on instinct. This isn't accidental. It usually comes from a psychological pull toward depth. Empaths tend to value felt experience over symbolic representation. They usually care more about what something means than how it looks, more about emotional reality than social optics. And that makes performance culture feel strangely hollow to them, because so much of social media is built on converting life into image. But empaths often prefer life before it turns into image, the unmediated experience, the quiet conversation nobody else overhears, the sunset no camera interrupts, the personal victory no audience claps for, the moment that gets to exist fully without ever becoming content. There's something genuinely philosophical hiding in that, because it raises a question almost nobody stops to ask. At what point does documenting your life start interfering with actually living it? That question matters, because once identity becomes tied to display, experience turns instrumental. Moments stop being lived for their own sake and start being collected for presentation instead. And when that happens, something essential quietly disappears: the sacredness of immediacy, the intimacy of presence, the fullness of undivided attention. Empaths tend to guard those things fiercely, because they understand, consciously or not, that attention is life. Wherever your attention goes, your existence gets shaped by it. And if attention keeps getting redirected towards self-presentation, something deeper starts to erode: inner stillness, authenticity, contact with reality as it actually is, instead of how it appears on a screen. That's why many empaths push back against the pressure to turn their entire personal existence into ongoing public performance. Not because they're detached from the world, but because they're trying to stay connected to what's real, and in this era, that's an increasingly rare thing to protect. There's another psychological layer worth naming here. Empaths are often deeply uncomfortable with self-objectification, with shrinking themselves into something to be consumed, evaluated, arranged for approval. That discomfort can be hard to put into words, because most people have already normalized it completely. But empaths feel it. They sense the exact moment identity starts turning into product, when personhood starts turning into brand. And plenty of them quietly step away from that, not because they're better than anyone else, but because they refuse to become performers in a marketplace built around perception. They just want to stay human. That sounds simple. It isn't. In a culture built entirely on spectacle, choosing to remain unperformed is genuinely an act of resistance, and empaths practice that resistance constantly, without ever putting a name on it, by not posting every achievement, by keeping joy private, by letting experiences belong to themselves instead of an audience, and maybe most importantly, by refusing to confuse attention with meaning. That refusal changes how an entire life gets lived. Because once you stop asking, how will this be perceived, you can go back to asking, what is this moment actually asking me to experience? And that's a completely different way of existing. It leads to a slower life, a deeper one, a less performative one, a life where meaning doesn't depend on an audience. Many empaths are drawn to that even when they can't fully explain why. They just know constant performance drains them. It feels false, fragmented, emotionally expensive. So they quietly step out of it, deliberately, one choice at a time. Other people sometimes read this the wrong way, assuming the empath has become disengaged, distant, socially absent. But often the exact opposite is true. The empath may actually be more engaged with reality than the people documenting every second of it, simply because they aren't splitting themselves between experience and projection. They're just there, present. And presence, psychologically speaking, is one of the rarest and most powerful capacities a human being can have. It sharpens perception. It deepens relationships. It strengthens intuition. It restores peace. Empaths often choose it over visibility without hesitation. And that isn't avoidance. That's value alignment. It's choosing being over appearing. And that might be one of the most meaningful choices a person can make, because eventually, everyone runs into a question the digital world keeps trying to answer for them. Is your life something to be lived or something to be displayed? Most people never pause long enough to even notice the difference. Empaths often do, and that single pause changes them completely. It makes them more selective, more inwardly anchored, less impressed by spectacle, less willing to trade depth for attention. And in a lot of cases, that's exactly why they don't feel any pull to constantly post themselves, because they've too busy actually inhabiting a life instead of curating one. Maybe that's what the world quietly needs to be reminded of. Not every meaningful life is highly visible. Not every fulfilled person is highly displayed. Not every powerful presence is chasing recognition. Some of the deepest people you will ever meet aren't performing themselves at all. Theirs. Simply living fully, quietly, real. And there's real strength in that. Because in an age where almost everyone is being pulled toward performance, the person who stays present starts to look almost revolutionary. The person who refuses to turn every moment into evidence becomes genuinely free. And the person who lives for the depth of an experience, instead of the optics of it, might just be the one who understands life the clearest of anyone. Because what you refuse to perform may be exactly what your Zaire finally learned how to truly keep for yourself. Once you understand that many empaths don't avoid posting because they lack confidence, that they protect privacy as a boundary, and that they choose presence over performance, one final layer reveals itself, and it might be the most misunderstood one of all. Sometimes what looks like withdrawal is actually self-respect. This is where the psychology goes even deeper, because there are empaths who used to be completely open, people who shared freely, trusted easily, posted often, explained themselves constantly, made themselves emotionally and personally available to almost anyone. And then life taught them something. Not through theory, through pain, through betrayal, through manipulation, through being misunderstood in moments when they were completely sincere, through discovering firsthand that visibility can attract projection just as easily as admiration, exploitation just as easily as connection. And once that realization lands hard enough, something inside them shifts permanently. The empath becomes more discerning. But from the outside, discernment usually looks identical to distance. And that's exactly where people get it wrong. They assume the person turned cold, guarded, detached. But what actually happened is often far more sophisticated than that. The person develops standards, and standards, especially after real pain, tend to become the architecture of self-respect. That matters, because a lot of people interpret reduced openness as damage, but sometimes reduced openness is simply wisdom. Sometimes the person posting less, revealing less, exposing less, hasn't become wounded at all. They've become awake. They've recognized a hard truth. Not everyone who gains access to you actually deserves access to you. That realization changes behavior, and honestly, it should. Because maturity isn't staying equally open after every single betrayal. Maturity is adjusting what you allow. Empaths often do this in quiet but powerful ways. They stop over-explaining themselves to people who are committed to misunderstanding them. Anyway, they stop offering emotional transparency to people who weaponize vulnerability, the second pote. They get it. They stop making themselves easy to read for people who study openness, purely for leverage. And yes, sometimes that means they stop posting personal photos, not because they're afraid of being seen, but because they've already learned the real cost of being casually exposed. There's serious psychological intelligence hidden in that shift, because self-respect usually begins the exact moment you stop offering yourself to spaces where you keep getting mishandled. That isn't bitterness, that is easing.